Look, this is meant to be a real informal, casual conversation about some stuff. I've prepared some questions for these guys, but would really love to hear from the audience as well. As I look up across this stage, obviously all of us are involved in what we would call ministry now, in some way, shape, or fashion. I'm ordained as a pastor in the Free Methodist Church, spent 32 years doing the pastoral thing, spent the last 10 years doing something that feels more like business. Casey, you started as a guy in business, and you have a number of years in that, but you now are ordained a United Methodist pastor, correct?
Yes, sir.
So you are really messed up. You're not sure whether you're coming or going.
Corporate banker turned Methodist, kind of crazy.
So, yeah, in counseling, okay. And then, so we've got an array here. Gaston, you're ordained in the United Methodist Church as well, correct? Okay. And Steve, I love you. You tell your story a little bit. You are wired as a business guy, but the Nazarenes made you go to seminary and almost ruined you.
Up.
Yeah.
So, I started out in banking and data processing back when computers took up big rooms just to run 30K, not meg, 30K. Remember those? And then I got sidetracked into international economics and just couldn't get away from the bigness of the world and went that direction and studied missiology and been trying to figure out how those two mesh together ever since.
And is it a fair statement to say that your denomination, which is not uncommon for most of our denominations, felt that anybody that wanted to do ministry needed then to go and get ordained? And so they made you go do some...
Yeah, 45 years ago or 50, whatever. It's been, I'm old, okay, so, you know. But that was the mindset. You really couldn't do missions without ordination first. So it was that was the track, the only one open to me. Well, other than medicine, yeah, I could have been a medical doctor, but I couldn't spell penicillin. So, you know, if you weren't a medical doctor, you were a preacher, and so that's what I did because that's what they told me to do, and that required the whole thing, and then 2 years of pastoring and ordination, and then I got to go. And it was okay, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't me. I mean, I just did it because that was the way you got there.
Gotcha. So I wanted you to have a little bit of a context here that you're talking to some folks that have spent years doing kind of pastoral things, and you've got business people that are now kind of living in the world of ministry kinds of things as well. And we just want to explore some of the tensions that exist in that world. I've got a question to start things out, and we'd love for you to be thinking of questions, but here's the other thing. It's just as okay to make comments. You may need to vent something today. You may just need to vent something.
In a nice way, please. Please vent nicely.
But this would be a great opportunity and a great place to kind of vent some thoughts, some questions, or anything else in regards to what you've experienced in trying to work with those that are not in the same space that you are. So I'm going to throw this out to the group as a whole, and don't feel like you each one have to answer this, but I'm going to throw some things out, and we'll see where it sticks on each one of you, okay? What's one of the greatest challenges for you as a marketplace or a ministry leader to working with those in the opposite space? It's one of the greatest challenges that you've found.
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about this tomorrow, but I think in our case, we tried to start up in a church and had a mismatch of our philosophies, and we found we had to go outside the church. And I think a lot of it had to do with what... an activity-based mindset as opposed to an outcome-based mindset in the church. And I think, I've studied a little bit about what has gone on through Significant Matters and some of our other guests up here, but I think the challenge of helping churches think about what the future of mission is and how to connect it to outcomes and how to then connect people to relationships and not just activities. That's been my biggest challenge, and one that we had to go outside the church to do the way we wanted to do it.
Now he's said a lot. Anybody experienced that frustration? He's said between activity and outcomes, a tension between activity and outcomes. Anybody experience that? Oh, you're being polite. You're being nice. I see some heads nodding yes. An interesting way to put it. There's a tension between the church, which tends to be satisfied with activity. Am I hearing you say that?
Yep.
Versus the marketplace person who is never satisfied with activity, only results. Okay? All right. And feel free to chime in on these. Go ahead, Casey.
Yeah, picking up on that, I was going to say keeping up, because once marketplace people in your church recognize that you're going to focus more on outputs and impact, and that's something that they can engage themselves in as high capacity folks, your job then becomes keeping up with them, and as opposed to trying to pull them along. So yeah, once you're focusing away from being Santa Claus for Jesus and instead focusing on what it means to create sustainable change, and people recognize that if they invest their hard-earned generosity into something that isn't going to have to be replenished next year and next year, but it's actually going to create lasting change, then you just got to keep up.
I think somebody, I'll say this. One of the things that I find most frustrating in working with marketplace people is, this is a safe place, is that in the same way that marketplace people oftentimes feel that those in ministry are naive about what they call the real world and how things work out in the real world. I've heard that lots of times. And I think now that I've kind of lived more in that world here with Significant Matters, I do understand what they were saying at that time, and I could even say that there's a lot of truth in that, never having to live with the kind of results that you do in the marketplace because you go out of business otherwise. But I think that the same thing happens on the other side, is that I think most marketplace people are naive as to the amount of work that it takes to bring about any kind of change, sustainable or otherwise, in the context of poverty. And so running into people like Jacqueline Novogratz, who in her wonderful book, The Blue Sweater, talks about patient capital. When I first read that phrase, I said, that's it. Every business person I ever meet needs to understand the concept of patient capital and why it is absolutely, essentially, something you have to understand if you're going to take it into the world of poverty, in large part because poverty deals in a cash flow world versus a capitalist world. And I find most marketplace people, in the same way marketplace people that most ministry people kind of glaze over when you start talking about the business kinds of stuff that you're doing and that kind of stuff because they don't get it. Well, I think most business people kind of glaze over when we start talking about things like patient capital and those kinds of things. And it's not, we're not trying to just kind of get away from results at that point. That is a very real piece of the puzzle that I have found very few marketplace people willing to step into that and figure out what it takes to bring patient capital into this whole thing. So that's been my experience and some of my frustration at times. Grady, you want to chime in on anything, buddy? We want to give you plenty of, you're dying.
Because I would just ramble on. No, Tom and I have only talked about this twice a day for the last 8 years. It is frustrating. And, it's not necessarily naive. It's just different.
No,
and
it's
I
naive.
think no.
No, it's naive, but go ahead.
It's just different. Marketplace people, business people, have an entirely different speed and approach to the way that they attack something. And that's what they do. They attack something to try and get to the solution, to get to the end. We don't necessarily think through the entire thing before we jump in feet first because we know sometimes you just got to jump in feet first. Ministry folks, it's been my experience, or run out of cash. They think stuff through a lot better than marketplace people do. And they have great theories behind why these things should work and will work. But it does take the combination of the two together to actually make it happen. And this conversation and the recognition of that difference is what I think is so very important. If we could just get all on the same page before we attack any problem at all and just agree to that, then we could easily accomplish some of these individual solutions. Jay, you had something to say? I'm not going to point anybody out here.
I mean, we would love to just hear this. We're capturing it on video and planning to send it back to your pastor. But don't worry about that. Seriously, don't worry about that. No, because Craig, I want you. We've got
You
some
just scared
pastors
him
back
off.
there too. I mean, I really would like to have some of you ministry staff too. This is a chance to kind of be honest about that tension and frustration that exists. I know I felt it in the pastoral ministry. So, anyone else? Yeah, back there.
Well, one of the challenges marketplace people may not know, when you're dealing with employees, they're paid and they have to do a certain job. And in the church, you're mobilizing volunteers who come with their own ideas of what the church should do. They have their own felt needs. They have their own felt passions. And yes, we move at a snail's pace. Yes, we do. Yes, we need you to prod us forward. But when we have to get buy-in through different groups of people, that takes a whole lot of time. I mean, to do anything, we really do have to take it through 3 or 4 or 5 committees, because if we go ahead of them, we're not going to, it will fall on its face and before we get buy-in, and we have to utilize spiritual and relational capital. We don't have a paycheck so that's one challenge, obviously.
Anytime you guys want to chime in.
Yeah, that's good. The 4 or 5 committees, you'd probably have to pull our eyeballs out of our head to sit through the 4 or 5 committees to make that decision. Another comment on it.
So I'm a church planting pastor, which kind of puts me in a different category and kind of combines both the marketplace and the ministry mindset. I don't have 4 or 5 committees. If something wants to be done, I can just do it, and that's the beauty of a church plant, especially a independent, non-denominational church plant. However, I'll say this, though, as somebody who is a ministry-minded person, I think one of the key differences, and maybe this kind of clarifies things for me, is when I look at something, my question is always, as somebody who's kind of theologically minded, my first question is always, is this right? Is this true? Is this biblical? That sort of thing. And I know my marketplace friends look at something and say, you know what? They say, will this work? Right? And that's the whole outcome kind of orientation. But I think like just looking at problems and looking at potential solutions from completely different perspectives is really, really helpful and really, really necessary. Otherwise, those of us who are theologically minded never do anything, and those of us who are outcome driven don't really. It can just be outcome driven, which can be dangerous at times too. So
I think that's a really important distinction that you brought up, but I think that's the reason why we need marketplace folks to force us to be outcome driven, because if we have the best intentions that produce outcomes that aren't in line with our intentions, then we're in trouble. And I think our marketplace people really force us to wrestle with how do we implement our best intentions in a way that actually produce outcomes that are not dependency creating, that are sustainable, that are transformational, and sometimes that has to be in spite of our best intentions or our good intentions.
I'm going to need a little help in communicating this, but
That's always a scary thing to hear. As a pastor, you go, oh no.
right. So you pastoral
No,
guys
go
can
ahead.
help
Do it.
me.
Do it. You can do
But
it.
I do think I'm a little troubled by what I'm hearing, and the reason for that is this: I understand difference in temperaments and in personality, but there should not be any difference in life force and in root and who our king is. And if the same spirit lives in me that lives in missional guys, which I believe that's true, then that means the basis of our life and our motivation is the same. So I don't see it as an either or. That's this bifurcating thing all over again. I think we need to develop a construct or just a way of living that we appreciate the differences in personality and temperament, just as I do on my entrepreneurial team with my board of directors or my executive teams. They're all different. They all bring a different skill set. They all bring a different way of looking at things. But at the end of the day, what drives all of us is the same. I think for us who love Jesus, whether we are a part of the laity or the clergy is irrelevant. What drives us is the Spirit of God. And therefore, our thinking should be the same. And we need to sit down and talk about the differences in our thinking and why that is true. Is the difference in our thinking because of our theological constructs? Well, I'm no theologian, and most entrepreneurs are not, but I know a lot of entrepreneurs who can give a very fine theological construct of entrepreneurship and have it down to a T. I think, we have to find better ways of working together. Could it be that maybe some of the reasons that you have to go through 3 or 4 committees, I have to go through 3 or 4 committees, 3 or 4 boards, we express it differently. In the commercial, in the corporate world, we have a political chessboard that is an absolute nightmare. And we have to navigate that thing. And if you don't learn how to navigate your political chessboard, every single one of your projects will fail. I don't think that's a whole lot different from you guys going to your committees. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I would say to you, and I would extend my hand to you and say, look, I don't believe we are different, and I don't think we should be different in our approach. Our approach should be a kingdom approach. Yes, of course I have a different temperament, and maybe I might look at things differently, but that adds to the color of life and to the color of the kingdom. And you do exactly the same thing to me. So I think our attitude should be, how can we enrich each other by drawing on each other and being in fellowship with each other? We add richness and color and dimension to our lives. You enrich me because of that, and I learn from that, and I think you can learn from me. And I would like to see enterprise and pastoral people being joined at the hip like that, where we can progress the kingdom together in appreciation and understanding of one another. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say?
Someone else?
That's my
Jay has something.
I've got just a quick point or two. I think part of it is doing the work on the front end to identify what the principles are that a business or a church is going to operate under. And so there's principles that I think are about helping other people in the right way, and having those debates so that once you have the principles aligned and the values aligned, then you're not debating those, you're debating, kind of the solution set. And then the other piece is kind of framing the problem. And as a business person of 32 years or whatever, I like to work on the problem statement, and then I like to think of it as a system. And then once you start doing that and you have your principles figured out, you're kind of an entrepreneur. You're a social venture entrepreneur. And I think we've got to create some kind of a framework inside churches where we can experiment with things. Do them within the principles, but not necessarily get ourselves choked to death over consensus. And a lot of times consensus can kill kind of entrepreneurial spirit. You get an average instead of these outliers who you want to try to celebrate or turn loose. And some of them will fail. But there's a lot of business parallels. If we can figure out how to do that in churches, it might be, we'll all be better off.
And consensus will not only kill the entrepreneurial spirit, it'll kill the Holy Spirit.
Jay.
I think I struggle sometimes with the generality of marketplace people. I was one of those, I think, managers up and coming where I have no desire to have a business, zero. And if I gave my long testimony, I was just telling Josh here, God gave me 3 doors and he locked 2. So you can sit there and pound on the other doors, but at the end of the day, I was supposed to own a business. And I have a high growth business, and it's not this marketplace. There's a ton of executives and big corporations that know nothing about entrepreneurship. It's really different. And to lump us all in the same kind of, just marketplace people, we're not all wired up like that. And to understand there's some major, major differences of an executive team leader and a raw entrepreneur and I think that can sometimes when we're dealing with, if you're dealing with a hardcore entrepreneur within a church setting, you may have, they're just wired up a certain way, frustration for not just, taking the hill. It's the same thing on the business side where, that raw entrepreneur can only take a business so far, and you got to have some other people that come alongside. So I think some of maybe the naiveness, it's being cast out in general that we don't understand. It's like, there's like, whether I'm a manager or an entrepreneur or a technician, I don't know if you guys have read E-Myth, but some of the different, how we're wired can cause some different ways that we communicate with each other. Just like I would say on the ministry side, you got to have the same, whether your gifts are teaching or there's just it's a mixing bowl that we got to navigate this. And I think one of the beauties of one of the slides that said, I don't know, Tom, one of the slides said, hey, we're trying to build a structure and a framework where we can all jump in there and be able to hear each other. And I think that is a little bit what I'm hearing. This is kind of the premise of where this is going, but maybe helping us to have some grace with who we're talking to, because marketplace people aren't one person.
Yeah.
There's a whole slew of different people that you're dealing with in general.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and I would like to say I totally agree with that. And big company rules are not the same as small company rules, and C-suite executives are definitely not the same as entrepreneurs. But I do want to drive this home again, irrespective of our differences. As a man who is hopefully being transformed by the Spirit of Jesus who lives inside of me, it is always my responsibility and my desire, my earnest desire, to hear you, to understand your perspective, to honor you, to pray for you, to come alongside you, to love you. And it is not acceptable that my preconceived ideas block that interaction. There's a thing in the Bible called repentance, and all that word means is to change. All what we need to do, sorry, that's a simplistic statement, but some of what we need to do is to just change our attitudes. And yes, we're different. We come from different aspects. Well, so what? Big deal. You are my brother. You have the same Spirit of Jesus in you that I have in me. And I am here to honor you and to love you and to work with you and to cooperate and to collaborate and to move the kingdom of God forward. And I think it doesn't do any of us any good to stress our differences. We have a singular king. We serve a king. This is not a democracy. There is no consensus in the kingdom of God. There is one opinion, and that is the opinion of our king. So for me, my life finds value as I join him in what he's doing, and as I join other brothers, irrespective of their backgrounds or their thinking, as I join them to serve my king and his purpose. And I think we should start there.
We've got one over here.
We have a couple more. Since I have the mic, I'm just going to say something
Yeah,
real
you go
quick.
right ahead. Yeah, you can.
I don't disagree with anything that you're saying at all, Ray, especially about the fact that we're all the same. But the way in which we communicate together is different, and it's because of the environments that we live in day to day. I was just at a lunch not too long ago with my pastor of my church, and I'm sure he'd be okay if I tell this story. But we had some business to take care of, and we went through it, and we sat down. It was a lunch meeting, and we got through it. And at the end, I'm like, oh, wow, I'm sitting with my pastor. Okay, pastor, how's your wife and family? Is everyone doing good? And I thought I was just, doing great just to ask the question. But he was a little taken back that I waited till the very end of our lunch to bring up the relationship or his family. I was taken back from that. We have a very different way of approaching meetings, of approaching day-to-day life. That's what we need to get on the same page with, is the communication. When we're literally coming into the room together to talk through things, it's a brewing fire pit sometimes, and it's hard to get past that communication barrier. And if we can do that, and we can agree to change, like what you're saying, then I think that's the key to success. We have a few things. I'm going to go in order of
one
hands.
over here, one over there.
I just wanted to say that there's one thing I constantly have in my mind and share with other people, and that is that if we can get everyone to understand that the individual, the organization, and the community at large are equally important, are interconnected, and interdependent, then it's a totally different story. If you look at people who play an instrument, it's beautiful to listen to, but if you listen to it in an orchestra, it's amazing. So the fact that we are different is beautiful. It's not a bad thing, but we are interdependent on each other and will continue to become more and more so as the change and the complexity of the world that we have continues to move forward.
More nuts and bolts.
More nuts and bolts.
I'm not a ministry person. I'm not a marketplace person. I deal with government programs, which of course is something that none of you do, except that you do. What kind of issues have you run into dealing with trying to implement projects and programs in an environment where suddenly it's not just a business issue or a ministry issue? Now you have government issues and programs and regulations and requirements to deal with.
It's interesting working with governments, especially in different cultures and different places. But it seems like marketplace people, the variety of marketplace people, the variety of ministry people, the variety of government officials, all have some things that they need and some visions that they want. And everyone seems to respond to a vision that inspires them. And those are usually part of the reign of God that begins to pull us forward. And I think it's interesting. I mean, the theme that we keep coming up in is that there's a value in that diversity that speaking to, and probably more importantly, hearing each other begins to help us have a stronger kingdom presence to put forward. Like for one example, one of the problems that I see with nonprofits is that we tend to not fire people. And they become bevies of incompetence because the talented people are frustrated and leave, and the other folks stay forever. But even that, we can use theological language in thinking of it. If someone is terrible at a job, they're not called to that job. That is not their vocation. They can't be happy at it. And so firing someone, we could even think of that as helping them discover their true vocation and moving them along the way. So I mean, and I know that's a silly example, but there's ways to process through this where we can each speak the same language in thinking through how to make things more efficient and driven by the outcomes.
Did we hear an amen?
You know, without the risk of becoming political, you know, some of the work I'm going to talk about is in Guatemala, but I also do some work in my local community. And I think governments, well, if we all thought about the people in need as customers and they need something, and we thought about our goal being how to make them self-sufficient, I think then we would have, you know, better goal alignment. And so I think in some countries there's no safety net at all. But in our country there's a safety net for a lot of historical reasons, but I think we're missing the point because sometimes we're measuring activities instead of outcomes. And you know, that's part of a theme that you're going to hear from me time and again. But I think that's if we could somehow reorganize government around a consumer mentality and around outcomes that we're we're trying to get people to be self-sufficient, for example. That would be very helpful, and I think that helps change the mindsets of all of our religious organizations at the same time.
Yes.
I'm sitting here thinking about marketplace and ministry and churches working together. And in Ephesians 4, it talks about pastors and teachers equipping the saints for the work of the ministry. And I think that a lot of times the churches have it backwards. We have this ministry, that ministry come and help. And not that that's wrong, but to me, the implication of Ephesians 4 is the church should be asking the saints, well, what is God calling you to do, and how can we come alongside and help you? So that's my comment.
Okay, there's over here. So while he's heading over there, I think a little bit like maybe a twist on what you're saying, Ray. I do agree that we're all in love with the same, the idea and that kind of stuff. But in the same way that my wife and I are very, very different, and no matter how hard I try, I can never think completely like a female. I just can't. I never will. And I'm done trying, by the way. And she's never going to think, and whatever that means, I mean, I don't want to even get into that, whatever that means, or I will never be able to think like an African American. I'm sorry, I can't. And there will be differences, and there will be things that I cannot quite see or understand that have to do with their experiences and the cultural differences that exist. And that's more of what I'm talking about here, that there are some deeply embedded things culturally in the mindset of a pastor. In the church, everything is personal. In the business world, what do you say? Nothing's personal. And I've seen it happen over and over again. And that is a truism as I've seen it. It's not personal. But in the church, I'm telling you, as a pastor, everything's personal. Everything. Right. Who gets to play the piano and who doesn't get to play the piano? It's personal. Right. Who gets on the team and who doesn't get on? It's personal. And you can't make that go away at ever. And it's always in the back of the mind of a pastor. That is a reality that they're living with. Now, I'm not here trying to say that it can be anything. I'm just saying that cultural difference shapes our reactions to things that are said in meetings. It shapes how we set up certain situations, things we're willing to step into and things that we're stepping into. And the only reason I even want to bring this up is, to me, it's a little bit like the cultural competency classes that we do between African American and Americans, is that if we can learn to talk about the true cultural differences that exist in these two categories, then there comes a point, I think, where we then can become humble enough to understand I will never quite see what it is in that thing. And I will trust you enough to just kind of live in that ambiguity, and vice versa. And I just see a lot of this happening between marketplace and ministry people, because they can't even admit that there are these cultural differences, and we're not quite sure what to do with them. So let's go right over there, and then we'll go. Go ahead.
If I could just, I'm sorry to jump in, but there's often, I think it's sometimes helpful to think of continuums of thought, with masculine and feminine continuum, sometimes with men falling on one side or the other and women falling on one side or the other, and also cultural continuums, because our culture does shape how we think and how we see the world. But I would think when we start talking about, men and women and people of different, what the world labels as racial backgrounds, there's these continuums that do cut across those things depending on the culture that we're from. And I just kind of throw that out because sometimes it helps us process through things. I had a South African friend once that told me, he said, Americans are funny. Anytime we have an American in the meeting, they become the dominant person. Even if there's just one of them there, it becomes a soup. And the dominant flavor in a soup takes over the whole meeting. And what we need is a stew, because in a stew you have all these different flavors, but you can taste each individual flavor. And that image that he had just kind of stuck with me in thinking through even how we discuss these things in a group. To hear different voices is important. And I think it's important in the marketplace as well as in the ministry. Because marketplaces are better if they can hear those voices. And we haven't always been good about doing that in the marketplace or in the church. But so I think there is some continuums there.
Thanks, that's
Yeah,
great.
you
James.
summarized that really well. And the word culture kept coming up. So one of the things I've learned in the business world, and I think is true in the ministry world, is culture eats strategy for lunch every day. You can have the greatest plans and strategies and structures and wonderful buildings, but if you don't communicate in a relevant way to the culture and connect at the cultural level correctly, it will fail. And so the earlier gentleman who quoted Ephesians 4, I thought that was timely as well. With how do we help the how do we have the ministry ask more from the saints, and so versus the equipping, it's how do you get both ministry and marketplace folks working together? And so actually have been a part of that, where my church took a bit of a risk in asking 5 or 6 business leaders to lead the creation of mission strategy, and have come alongside those business leaders to create that strategy. We're how many months into it now? I guess seems like a long time. Yeah, over a year we've been at this, and it's been a heck of a lot of fun. And I will say, I don't think we would be where we're at without the 2 of those groups coming together. I don't think it could have been completely ministry driven and then handed over to the marketplace folks or vetted by the marketplace folks. Just the same as I don't think it could have been completely created by marketplace folks without ministry involvement. And it's been a 1 + 1 = 3 and hopefully more. And so I will just say, from the now several months into it, it's been a lot of fun. There's been a lot of honesty, openness about those differences, recognition of when expectations might be different from, say, marketplace folks versus the ministry team. And the gentleman who mentioned you're from the government side, I felt compelled to just jump into like prayer for you. Because we really struggle with bureaucracy just amongst our own infrastructure. When you insert the government factor in there, just state, local, whatever, it just makes me want to pray. So my point is, it has to be a collaborative process, which is obvious, and it's a long term. It's not a quick, here are a few meetings, let's have a few meetings, invite some marketplace folks, get their opinion, and then check back in 9 months. There's got to be a drumbeat and a rhythm for those parties to come to the table and have a seat at the table, and it's a heck of a lot of fun. So I would encourage you, whatever background you come from, ministry, marketplace, is ensure that you have representation from both, and it'll be much, much richer for it.
Just real quick, Ray, I know you want to say something. We're approaching our time here. I have a couple more questions out here, and Ray, if you want to go ahead and talk through yours.
I'll make this brief. I think those are excellent comments, and I would just like to say that I do believe we have a breakdown with many Christian entrepreneurs in that they don't have a clue what a kingdom business looks like in our postmodern 21st century world. And they don't have a clue how that business is supposed to act and interact within our society and with their vendors, and particularly with their employees. Oftentimes I find people who genuinely love Jesus, but they run their businesses just like anybody else, just like any secular business in the world does. And that's just not acceptable. I believe there's a tremendous need to sit down and teach and instruct Christian entrepreneurs as to what a kingdom business is. Because in the world you get the attitude, like you just said, Tom, that it's not personal. Well, in a kingdom business, it most certainly is. Matter of fact, business, entrepreneurship is all about people. End of story. A business is not a living entity. It's dead to the wind. The only place in which a business lives is within the constraints of the law. You take it outside of the legal system, it is just a foundation. It is a platform for people to excel and to jump off the diving board and to display their gifts and their creativity. Great businesses do not produce great people. Great people produce great businesses. And great people produce great products that are bought by other great people who are in the marketplace. The marketplace is just people. Everything is people. So a kingdom business is all about people. We need to train our entrepreneurs as to what that means and what does a Christian business look like? They don't have a clue. And it is to be markedly distinctive.
Yep.
Ray, you set up the comment I was going to share perfectly. I spent 30 years in business, and there was no objective I wasn't willing to run through 10 walls to make and to run my team through. And oh, by the way, I loved the people and cared for them. Yeah, right. I did, but the objective was what was foremost. We're going to go get that thing. And there's a really important difference between seeing people as the important thing and, oh, we'll go get the objective. But these people are what's going to live on for eternity. They are eternal beings. When I put the objective first, when I put the striving first, when I put I'm going to accomplish this thing first, I'm saying I'm my own God in many ways. I don't need to depend on him. I'm going to go get this thing. At least that was true of me. So I've left 32 years of business to go into the leadership of a ministry and I had cared for people while I was striving for that objective, but I didn't always care for them the way Jesus would have had me. So that's the difference. I think we have to recognize he's the one that brings the results. We are absolutely called to join him. And we have a part and we have a giftedness, and let's go get it. And let's not wait around and dilly-dally, and let's recognize each other's skills. But let's really, really remember that we are people who are called to love each other in the power and grace of him and reflect him to a world that doesn't get that.
Great. We have one last comment before we wrap up.
I'll try and keep this brief. I've got a friend who wrote a book a few years ago, How the Church Fails Business People and What Can Be Done About It. I'm doing years of research on that topic. And he opens the first couple chapters with talking about how business people, when they come to work, there's typically a culture as to how business runs, and many times you're encouraged to leave your ethics and your faith at the door. You come here to business, you do the work the way that we do the business here. In the second chapter, he's talking about how pastors are often not knowledgeable about economics, about business, how it works. They feel intimidated to talk about it, and so they don't really address it from the pulpit and talk about it. And the overwhelming majority of business people that he surveyed and interviewed said that they had never heard from the pulpit an affirmation of business as a calling of work that they were supposed to do. So you've got these both worlds, neither one talking about how our faith is supposed to interact with business. And it's not just that there's an absence of that. Like I said, in the business world, there's some cases where you're actively discouraging people from bringing your faith into the discussion. And in the church, there are people, businesses about greed and about selfishness and about profits and taking advantage of people when we're supposed to be out giving and caring. You get this whole thing going. And so they're actively discouraging that conversation happening as well. And I participate in trying to help find ways to make that conversation happen. But I think the most effective way that conversation is going to happen is what each of you are doing, which you are providing us with stories that we can begin to talk about in terms of what happens to people's lives that get transformed, and it's happening through business. And there begins a discussion point where there's something now to talk about that's concrete rather than ethereal, abstract ideas about theology or about economics. And I think this is where the future is. I'm hopeful maybe not in the immediate future, but in the not too distant future, that we'll begin to see the two worlds begin to come together. Thank you for all your work.
Thank you. And I'd like to close with this thought about that. At the Protestant Reformation, a lot of things happened. Luther brought us into the sola scriptura, the sola faith, and all of those kinds of things. The other part of the Protestant Reformation that I'm convinced never really happened, and I can't help but to believe may be happening right now, was what he called the priesthood of all believers. And it was the idea that each of us, that under the lordship of Christ, every one of us, our vocations is a calling.
Amen.
And that we have elevated the role of paid clergy to a point that I would argue is unbiblical. And part of what we're seeing in the world right now is that we cannot be relevant to the world as it is and where it's going today, except that we elevate the role of marketplace and begin to erase that artificial line between secular and sacred. And that we're in this dance right now of trying to figure out how to lead together, both from marketplace backgrounds and ministry backgrounds. I can't help but to wonder, is this the fulfillment of that piece of the Reformation, the priesthood of all believers? I sure hope so.